Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Carr. I believe I'm approaching my third year as a PhD student at Regent University, and I appreciate all of you taking the time to view my presentation. What I wanted to bring you today was something beyond just a general sense of grief and grief support. Instead, I wanted to bring you kind of some non-traditional methods of grief support, and I don't mean non-traditional in the way that these are new ideas or that they're ideas that maybe you've never heard of. I think we've actually covered some of these in some form during this class alone, and it's just this idea of integrating different perspectives of grief support into your typical talk therapy modalities that you typically see in grief support. And what I want to do is just kind of show how that's been a reflection of my personal and professional development over time. So I wanted to bring you these in regards to training as a mental health professional. And I can tell you that grief support training, one of the issues over the years has been that many even KCREP or APA accredited programs don't typically have a standalone course that's dedicated solely to grief support in their programs. Instead, what they tend to do, and what mine did in my master's in counseling tended to do, was just interweave grief support into a variety of different courses and cover it that way, which gave me a pretty clear sense of what grief support was, but classes like this have been really pivotal in helping me to gain a better understanding of it as a bigger picture. And so when we think about training, one of the highlights here is that we are working with diverse populations, whether or not it's grief support or cognitive behavioral therapy. It doesn't matter the direction you're going, it doesn't matter your clientele. Our clientele is a diverse clientele. We're working with people who have different personalities, different cultures, and different things like that. And so it's really important here that we highlight how we can implement and improve the grief support training we receive, but also how we can implement and improve the grief support that we provide to the populations that we serve. And so what I want to do today is briefly kind of go over how culture and diversity impact the kind of training we receive, but it also impacts the kind of training that we provide to other people. When you think about culture and diversity, it's really simple to get trapped in the basics. And when I say the basics, what I'm talking about is it's easy to think of culture and diversity simply as the differences in gender and race and ethnicity, things like that. But we have to think beyond that and start looking at the different ways in which culture and diversity can be a barrier or can be something that hinders the process of providing counseling to somebody. And so when we think about language barriers, it's not just Spanish versus English. It can also be the way in which you were raised, the community you were raised in. There's different lingo. There are different dialects of the same language. There are different ways that people refer to things depending on the way that you were raised. Occupational culture can also be a barrier. The best way to think about that is that imagine our emergency response personnel. So our police officers, our firefighters, our EMTs, our EMS people have a very different culture as an occupation than, say, a bank teller does. And in the same way, a bank teller has a very different culture as an occupation than does a lawyer. And so when we think about rural America, there are a lot of different things that can play into this, including the language barriers, your occupational barriers, the stigma that comes with receiving counseling, just stepping into the office alone. And then you think about cultural dynamics as a whole. One of the ways that a pretty popular crisis intervention book defines culture is an individual's grieving, at least the culture in terms of grief support. They say that an individual's grieving is a continuous negotiation process among a wide array of sociocultural influences specific to the person and the environment in which he or she lives. So what that's saying is that the beliefs, the value systems, the rules, whether or not you or the person you're serving grew up in an individualistic or a collectivistic kind of society. And then you think about the historical factors that have played into the different cultures of the people that we serve and our own culture. And I keep saying our own culture because it's important to note that our cultural perspective is just as important as the client's cultural perspective, and we have to understand that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in detail towards the end, but I just want you guys to kind of keep that fresh in your mind as we're going through this, that our culture is just as important as their culture, and how we integrate those and how we work around those different the things that make our culture different from theirs is really important. And then probably one of the most problematic barriers for people receiving support of any kind is access. So in terms of access, when you think about rural America, this is not a unique circumstance just to Texas, because I'm going to give you an example regarding Texas, which is where I live right now. But rural America really has the greatest disparity gaps when it comes to accessing healthcare. And it's because a lot of rural America might be anywhere from 50 to hundreds of miles away from the nearest healthcare or behavioral health provider. So when we think about culture, we also have to consider the way in which access is available to somebody. Do they have the primary care providers within their community, or are they having to travel? And when you think about those barriers, it can create a very problematic situation for people to receive support, especially specialized support like grief support. And so what I want to do is just give you a really short glimpse into some of the disparity gaps in Texas as an example. Texas is obviously one of the largest states in the United States. As far as land mass is concerned, it's one of the largest for sure. And population as well, it's also very large in population. There are just over 29 million people in Texas alone. And so when we think about these disparity gaps, what I provided for you is 4 different counties in Texas with very distinct differences in the kind of services that are available. And when you think about Harris County, which is the 3rd largest county in the United States right now, Harris County has a population of 4.8 million people. And if you notice in this graph, it explains or shows you at least the different licensed providers of a behavioral health service within the area. What this information does not provide, however, is it does not include all of those different professions. The associate or intern licensed professionals, like a licensed professional counselor intern, like myself, is not included in these numbers. And then also keep in mind as we're talking about this that highlighting licensed masters in social work, those LMSWs typically do not provide any formal counseling or therapy in Texas. They can't provide it because they're not licensed to do so. In order to do that, they would have to move on to the category right next to them, which is the licensed clinical social worker. So that's the difference between a licensed clinical social worker and a licensed master social worker. For the most part, is a clinical social worker is licensed and can provide counseling because they've gone through the 3,000 hours of supervised counseling experience. They have taken a counseling exam, things like that. And then additionally, it's also important to keep in mind that psychiatrists, while they are very heavily armed per se in behavioral health experience and behavioral health knowledge, they also don't typically provide any counseling beyond something that's informal and is more maybe psychoeducational than anything else, but they deal mostly in psychopharmacology, so they are prescribing medications. And then depending on the level of service provided, a licensed specialist in school psychology, something we would typically just call a school psychologist, can provide a level of counseling, but in the same respect, they're doing a lot of behavioral health intervention with special populations in schools. So not every single one of these populations provides a grief support opportunity, but when you think about behavioral health access as a whole, Texas has a large disparity gap because below Harris County is Lubbock County. Lubbock County is where I live. Lubbock, Texas is the seat of the county. And there are just over 300,000 people in this general region of Lubbock County. And you'll see that as compared to Harris County that has just under 10,000 behavioral health professionals, Lubbock County has just under, just under 850. It has 847 behavioral health professionals in our area. And then you think even more rural are these next two communities, which are Burleson County and Oldham County. So Burleson County, having a little over 17,500 people, only has 3 licensed behavioral health professionals in their community. And if you'll notice, one of those is a school psychologist, so they're working within a school district. And think about it that way. There's 1 licensed school psychologist for a community, a county of 17,000 people. Burleson County has about 3 different communities in it, so that's up to 3 different ISD school systems, and there's 1 school psychologist for an entire county. And then likewise, there are only 2 licensed master social workers in the community. Licensed master social workers can absolutely provide grief support in one capacity, and that would be kind of psychoeducational, providing education and outreach, but they don't provide formal grief counseling. And there is a difference between grief counseling and grief support. Grief support can come in the form of peer support groups being led by a behavioral health professional with knowledge of the topic. But then grief counseling, grief psychotherapy would be something that has to be delivered, at least in the state of Texas, by somebody who has a license to provide counseling. And so keeping that in mind, a county of over 17,000 only has 3 behavioral health professionals to provide that kind of service. And then Oldham County, which is just over 2,000 people, which is significantly lower than the 17,000 of Burleson, actually has 8 behavioral health professionals, 5 of which are licensed professional counselors, 2 of which can also provide counseling as licensed clinical social workers, and then 1 licensed master social worker. So this disparity gap is not unique to the United States. It's not that Texas has something that no one else does. It's that it's strange to see how even in a smaller community you can have more behavioral health professionals than a community that is quite a bit larger, that is over 5 times larger, for example, with Oldham County and Burleson County. So these disparity gaps create problems with access for people. So our diverse populations can't necessarily access the kind of service that is necessary. So to answer that gap, what I propose is, first, for access, I propose this idea that diverse populations need diverse strategies. And so what we have to do in this first one is with telecounseling. Telecounseling provides an opportunity to fill those gaps in the disparities, like transportation, funding, available licensed and experienced professionals to provide the grief support. And then what telecounseling also does is create access for marginalized populations. And then we're also going to cover at the end some art therapy techniques, which is just a second strategy for how to provide counseling in a non-traditional way that is very effective regardless of the population that we're serving. And so with telecounseling, what telecounseling is this utilization of video conferencing platforms to provide therapeutic support or services to individuals or groups. Basically, it's this idea, it's kind of like Skype counseling, except Skype isn't necessarily HIPAA compliant. So confidentiality and privacy are definitely an issue when you're not using a platform that provides a very secure, encrypted service. And so you'll see a lot of different platforms that are on the web. There are a lot of platforms that organizations use. The one that we use a lot over here is called Zoom. It's a free platform, so people can log in and you can provide that counseling in a safe, secure environment. But like I said before, telecounseling is this idea of providing a service where, for example, I might be 50 to 75 miles away from my client. And it's hard for them to get in and receive counseling because there's no counseling in their area. So we can provide telecounseling from the comfort of their own home, or from the comfort of a clinic like a federal qualified health center or something like that within their own community. So we've seen a lot of different ways in which people can get creative in providing this, but it's one way in which we provide an increase in access to care. But as I mentioned before, it is not a new concept. And so group psychotherapy via a video conferencing kind of platform actually had its first trials back in the 1960s, which seems a bit odd to think that they had video conferencing back in the 1960s, but they kind of redefined what video conferencing has become and what it was over the last several decades. And it was this push from this phone therapy to video conferencing, and then a push as a step beyond internet groups. So we talked in this class earlier in the semester about the different kind of internet groups that are out there where people can log in, they can chat with people. Sometimes you have access to a counselor, and sometimes that costs extra for the service. You have to log in, you have to have a sign in. This is something a little bit different because it is a direct one-to-one counseling professional relationship. It's no different from somebody being in your office. They are just seeing you on a screen as opposed to face-to-face in a room, sitting at a table or near a desk. So what we see with internet-based group treatment like telecounseling is you see an increase in anonymity. So that helps with that stigma. It provides an opportunity for people to receive treatment from locations that are proximal to their home when service is unavailable, because they can actually receive the service from the comfort of their own home or from the comfort of their primary care physician's office if you can establish relationships and connections with their primary care physician for office time and a location for doing the therapy. And then it provides hope to a greater population. And that's what we want to do, is be able to expand the offerings and access for people. So telehealth counseling clinic, what this is this is a clinic provided by the Brazos Valley region, which is kind of down by Texas A&M University and their School of Public Health. What they have is they have an APA accredited counseling psychology program, and what they recognized through needs assessments is that there was a need for grief support, and that there was a need for providing telehealth counseling to their rural populations, which I showed you. And Burleson County is actually one of those counties served by this Brazos Valley region. And so this clinic provides telepsychology services to the rural areas that are designated as mental health professional shortage areas. Anything from individual and couples counseling to group counseling. They offer it in English and in Spanish. And that's the beauty of telecounseling, is you can overcome those language barriers as long as you can find a provider who is fluent in that language. But what they did was they developed a telehealth grief support group. And what they had they had these counselors in one location, which was probably somewhere in the School of Public Health. They had their counseling clinic, and 100 miles away was a partner clinic. And what they did was they provided assessments to people who were interested in this program. And after they did these assessments, they provided an 8-week psychoeducational and support group on grief support to their participants over 100 miles away, with licensed counselors and behavioral health professionals in one location 100 miles away. Now, do keep in mind, as far as limitations are concerned, this was a very small sample size, but it's important to note that the participants all indicated that they would have gone without services if they didn't have that telehealth clinic. And so, regardless of the sample size with a project like this, it's important to note that this was an effective method for providing the grief support. Some of the additional limitations and challenges noted by this clinic were technology, of course. So equipment and connection are very important when it comes to providing telehealth or any kind of web-based counseling service. Of course, there's a cost associated with having the equipment, not only at the location of the counselor, but at the location of the client. So our clients may not have access to these things in their home, so we have to determine and develop different ways of providing this service. So everything from the webcams to the actual internet connection and the other equipment that's involved are things to keep in mind, which of course a School of Public Health and Texas A&M University would have had access probably to grant funds or funds to provide this to them. But then you also have to think about the different challenges that come with the environment. One thing that's hard to control from 100 miles away is the temperature in the room, or the noises and the sound quality and any distractions that may happen in the room that's 100 miles away from you. So having protocols in place to try to limit those kind of situations. One specific one that this telehealth counseling clinic noted were the camera angles were awkward. And so while the camera for the practitioners were right in front of them, the the clients 100 miles away at the clinic, it gave the impression that they were looking up at the counselor because of the screen and because of the camera angles. And so these little things are important to note, and can become challenges and barriers for people, because it can feel awkward. And then, of course, paperwork. How do you get paperwork signed from 100 miles away? And what they did was they designated liaisons at that clinic 100 miles away to take up these papers, get them sent to them in an appropriate manner and whatnot. And then, of course, any kind of crisis that comes up, it's important to note you have to have protocols in place to deal with the crisis if it happens during a telecounseling session, especially a telegroup session where you have multiple people involved, so you have multiple personalities, and any kind of group dynamics, any kind of group crisis or an individual crisis can occur. And then what I want to move towards in the interest of time is a different supplemental kind of therapy that can be integrated both with telehealth counseling, but also just in your private general kind of counseling that happens in a typical talk therapy counseling situation. Art therapy has been around for a long time, and it's important to note that art offers a direct way for clients to clarify and communicate their ideas, their feelings, and the interpretations without the constraints of language. And so what art therapy does is it provides an opportunity to break away from that mundane talk therapy that can happen, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then it also breaks down those walls when you're coming up against a client who is having a hard time getting over a hump, having a hard time getting over something, or you're having a hard time breaking through a specific circumstance or situation. It is important to note that art therapy a lot of times is not something that someone shows up to your office and they say, well, I'm struggling with the grief and the loss of my mother, my child, whatever it is. You're not just like, well, that's great, let's sit down and draw some pictures. That's not really how this works. Instead, art therapy can be a fantastic supplement to your already existing relationship that you have with a client. Now, younger children react to art therapy a lot better, especially in the beginning as an initial benefit, than do adults, because we're talking about a developmental level of providing a service. So we want to integrate it with other modalities. For example, that I'm going to give you, it's going to integrate it with narrative therapy and traditional talk therapy. So I want you to take a moment, look at this picture, and kind of think about what you see. And if it's small, I apologize, but when you look at this picture, what do you see? Okay, you see some person who has a pile of unsharpened pencils, and they are sharpening pencils, and they're just that's all they're doing. They're just sharpening pencils. What I want to convey here, and I wish I could have presented this live so we could have some actual discussion on it, was I wanted to convey this idea that this is a very mundane task. Now, mundane does not mean it doesn't serve a purpose. Talk therapy can become mundane in a way. For example, talk therapies without action or intentional participation, they can create an atmosphere that, one, it might provide an evidence-based practice, but it's not very engaging to or with the client. Or it might be very engaging with the client, but it doesn't inspire movement towards positive goals, positive aspirations, and a movement out of the mundane cycles that they've been in. Or it might inspire that movement, but it doesn't break the cycle of monotony that can develop into a symptom of grief, because people constantly, when they're in grief, during grief counseling, will talk about how they just keep doing the same things over and over again, and that monotony can become a symptom of their grief. So what I wanted to highlight here is that, yes, this person is doing a mundane task, but this mundane task does still serve a purpose. Those pencils have to be sharpened, and those pencils serve a purpose, and it just creates this pile of shreddings over and over and over again. Yes, he's doing the same thing over and over again. It does serve a purpose, but it may not break that cycle of monotony that can develop into a symptom of grief, and it may not inspire movement. So in order to push through these mundane tasks, we have an integrated modality which combines those traditional talk therapies with, for example, the one I'm going to show you is narrative therapy and art therapy techniques. Typically, these are best introduced during a period where the client feels like they're doing the same thing over and over again, or when they are struggling to process the feelings and deepen a sense of self-awareness in their grief journey. The great thing about art therapy is that it's experiential. That means it creates movement, it inspires action, it breaks that cycle of mundanity, and it's hands-on, and it doesn't require any kind of language skill beyond being able to kind of process your feelings in a day. So what happened during a course with a professor, R.M. Goldberg, during a grief counseling class with his students, two particular students, only one of them was named for some reason, but Lynn Peterson and one of the classmates in R.M. Goldberg's class created what are called relationship trees, which can sound very much like a family tree or very much like a genogram, and they are not either one of those in any sense of the term. Instead, what these are a representation of the client's relationship to one particular individual. And I'm going to show you an example of two examples of relationship trees here in just a second, actually. And what it is that the trunk represents the loved one, while the different colored leaves represent the associations to that particular loved one. And the important elements here are that there have to be 3 separate colors for the leaves in order to process that grief, process the feelings with that particular loved one. And these green leaves represent those positive aspects, very much like the healthy leaves you would see in nature. And then the yellow leaves, excuse me, represent the mix of those positive and negative aspects of the relationship with the one who has passed on, much like how yellow leaves are partly living, but they're also kind of partly dying in nature. And then you have brown leaves, which are representative of the negative aspects of that relationship that don't provide any nourishment to the relationship, like the dead leaves we see in nature. So what typically occurs when you're doing the relationship trees with individuals is you can either have them draw their own trees, which one can be time consuming, but it can also be a barrier for people who spend their emotional and just their general energy on trying to figure out what they want their tree to look like, what do they want their leaves to look like. They spend their time coloring in the leaves, or they spend their time worrying, does my tree look good? So to try to get over some of those things, the best thing to do is to have pre-printed templates of trees and leaves. And we're going to talk about how there are different ways of delivering this to your clients. But what happens is there are a lot of prompts during these sessions in which you ask sample prompt questions like, what do you see as you look at your tree? What are you feeling as you wrote on your leaves? Or if you could change one leaf on the tree, what would it be? I know it might be a little confusing because you can't see one right now. I'm fixing to show you one. But when you think about these prompts, you want to encourage the clients not to censor their responses. And then you also want to encourage them to re-author the difficult aspects of their relationship and of those particular memories. And reauthoring is a term synonymous or specific to narrative therapy, in which they reauthor or re-envision the story or the memory and the relationship with that person. And that would look like, what would your loved one tell me about the memory if he or she were still here? Or what is it about this memory that prevents you from moving forward? What would enable you to work through this memory? And so these prompts are very important during this, because it's still providing that basic talk therapy, but it's providing an opportunity for a person to tell their story and then reauthor their story based on the way they're processing their feelings through the picture of the relationship tree, as you can see here. So relationship trees, number one, they can be pre-drawn and printed out for the client. And I think that's really important, because then you can focus on the actual content of the session as opposed to worrying about what the tree looks like. Those colors can be altered based on the client's perception, but it's important that there be 3 distinct colors for the different types of relationships and aspects. The shades and the leaf variations can be edited for those who have vision impairments, for someone who may struggle with color blindness, or for somebody who is actually vision impaired what you can do is provide different textured fabrics that they can actually place on the tree, and each fabric represents, or different texture represents, the different positive, negative, or mixed aspects of that relationship. You can also do it with adaptive softwares. It can be interactive with separate leaves to glue on where they see it, depending on the age of the person or the developmental level. And what it does is it allows the clients to tell their story, to identify those problematic areas, and then, like we said before, reauthor the conversation. So as you can see on the side here, this person was processing their relationship with their mom, and you can see the positive aspects that they identified were things like trip to Florida, her perfume, her smile, singing "I Will Survive." So these are some examples, and then those aspects that were kind of negative and positive is that they identified that their mom was very permissive. The fashion sense was kind of an interesting one. It'd be nice to dive into what that really meant, but the sense of humor, and that mom spent a brief time in recovery. And then they identified the negative aspects of the relationship were that mom seemed to struggle with alcoholism, had a very strong focus on her appearance, left child home by themselves a lot, had a string of awful boyfriends, and also when they argued, mom tended to be physically abusive in the form of slapping. So these allow people to process those emotions where it might have been difficult to just basically talk about them or ask them. It provides an opportunity for them to go beyond a language barrier. And so to kind of close this out, what I did is I made sure to do my own relationship tree. And I think that that was important because I needed to kind of understand how this process would work as an element of practice. But what it really did was also provided an opportunity for me to have some self-reflection and personal development in addition to my professional development. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't point out just briefly that part of my professional and personal development has been my relationship with Christ, and how important it is that I recognize that that's part of my cultural story. Part of my self-reflection was recognizing that in Romans 12:1, what you see is that this whole chapter is it starts with this period of self-reflection. It starts off with, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And I think of this renewing of our mind as this self-reflection, not to be transformed by the ways of the world. Instead, through self-reflection, be renewed, be transformed. And then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And then as it goes on through these different humble services in the body of Christ and love in action, what it's really talking about is that just as in verse 4, just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. Everybody has different gifts, it goes on to explain, but it is through self-reflection first that we are then able to provide that a period of service to others. And so this provided an opportunity for self-reflection. For example, my culture, as an example, is a fear-based reaction culture. What that means is not that my dad was never abusive. My father never hurt us as kids. He never emotionally or spiritually or physically or any other kind of abuse to us at all. Instead, it was this idea that my dad taught me to resist help. And I'm going to explain that through my relationship tree here in just a second. And I know we're extending our time here, and I apologize. But my period of self-reflection helped me to see that my dad was kind of instrumental in creating this fear-based culture for me, in that I had to be 1, 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of everybody else. I couldn't let anybody see the way in which I could be vulnerable if you knew any bit of my history or anything about me. So I had to make sure to stay 1, 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of everybody else so that you couldn't get the jump on me and I couldn't be surprised by something. And then additionally, so when we look at my relationship tree, when I built it, we've got my dad. My dad passed away in 2015. Very suddenly, he actually passed away on his birthday. So this kind of circle of life thing, he came full circle. So it was really interesting. But my dad passed away in 2015. And so what I first identified were those positive aspects that I could remember. Now, his faith was very strong. He built that faith into everything that we did. And it was a very positive thing for me moving forward in my life. But also, one of the things that I remember most from my childhood and growing up was camping. And then what I remember most, and when you talk with people who knew my dad, what they remembered most about him was his laugh. It was very loud, it was genuine, very authentic, and it was from the deepest pit of his gut. And it just brings joyous memories for me. But then I had to identify those things that were kind of both negative and positive aspects. My dad was very supportive, but a lot of his support was built into my success as an athlete. So when I was successful in the sport that I was playing, he was very supportive, very interactive, very involved. But if I was not being what he considered to be the best athlete I could be, or if I wasn't the best athlete, period, then his support came in the form of aggressively helping me pursue something regardless of what my desires were. And so his support was inconsistent. And he was also inconsistent in the way that he treated my brother and my sister as opposed to me. He did not spend the amount of time on them that he did me. So I appreciated the attention, but my brother and my sister did not necessarily. And then my dad, he lied a lot. And those lies were things about our financial situation. They were things that he felt were protecting us. He would lie about the way he was struggling. He would lie about his depression, about some of his, what I believe were suicidal thoughts, and a suicide attempt that I know of. And so he lied about a lot of these things that could have been very helpful had he talked with someone about it, which has kind of led me to those negative aspects. When my dad was not being very supportive, he yelled a lot. He yelled to the point where we had a hard time rekindling a relationship later in our life because of the way in which he yelled at us kids. Another one was that he was overly giving. It seems like giving to others wouldn't be a negative aspect, but the problem was whenever he received a check for the service that he provided, or whenever he received his disability checks, he would basically turn around and just give those away, and he was easily taken advantage of by people, and it led to a lot of financial struggles for him. It led to his inability to pay for his medications and his medical services, things like that. And then most of all, the negative aspect was my dad refused help. He did not like to show that he was struggling in any way, and when someone found out, he would refuse the help that they would try to give him, even in the smallest capacity. And that kind of taught me to resist that help. Now, again, in the interest of time, and I apologize, what I wanted to do was just kind of highlight that this was a very reflective exercise for me, and it taught me this basic concept that fear isn't always a bad thing. Fear creates movement and it prompts action. And the fear and the pain that the people who are experiencing grief experience, that pain and fear can actually be the catalyst to their healing. And so basically what I wanted to provide for you today was just a brief introduction to telecounseling, and then a brief introduction to art therapy and how it can be integrated with narrative therapy, traditional talk therapy. You can even integrate this into group and grief counseling across a telecounseling session with somebody, because it's just about helping people process that pain, that fear, and that grief. So I appreciate you talking with me. I went way over time, and I apologize. Something I need to work on in the future. But I appreciate you guys listening to this. I am open to any questions you might have. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me by email, whatever the case may be. Thank you.